WSDQ Dunlap, WEPG South Pittsburgh, The Copperhead, WSDT Soddy Daisy, Chattanooga.
The viewpoints expressed on LibertyWorks Radio Network are not necessarily those of the network, its affiliates, or sponsors. This is LibertyWorks Radio Network. Now live from coast to coast and around the globe. More real talk, the kind you want, on LibertyWorks Radio Network.
And good afternoon to all of your LibertyWorks Radio listeners out there. This is 5 o'clock Central Time, 6 o'clock Eastern Time, 3 o'clock Pacific Time. And this is the time frame set by this network for the Truth Tech Hour. On Fridays, during the Truth Tech Hour, which happens every day this week, always at this time. But on Fridays, I'm your host. My name is Larry Becraft. I'm sitting here in my office in Huntsville, Alabama, and I extend a warm invitation to you to listen to this program. Now, I say a warm invitation because, I just got through reading some predictions about where this winter is going to be headed. Here it is, November the 22nd. We are 28 days from Christmas, but we're also 1 month away from the start of winter, and a lot of parts of the country, like down here in North Alabama, we are experiencing some winter activities. It's not necessarily fall weather. It's more along the lines of kind of winter weather. That is an indication that maybe all this crap about global warming is false. But I'm going to bring on the co-host of this program, Shaun O'Connor, who lives out in sunny California, and he is going to give us, before we get into the meat of this program, he's going to give us an update on California weather, and he's also going to give us an update on whether or not California is getting ready to suffer from the Black Plague. Shaun? You with us?
Yes, Larry. Hello. Hello, everybody out there. The weather here in sunny California is sunny during the day. About this time of year, that's about right. The temperatures are in the low 70s, mid-70s during the day. That's about right. They're dropping into the 40s, low 40s, mid-40s at night. That's about right. And we haven't had any rain here yet this fall, and that's about right. So everything here in California seems to be pretty normal.
Well, what about these rolling blackouts and the fire?
No, this is really crazy. We've got this great governor, Newsom, Gavin. He's quite a guy. And PG&E, if you all don't know, has been determined to be the cause of many, many, many of these wildfires out here. Everybody that's heard on the news that this is global warming that's hitting California, that is not true. It is PG&E, and they got hit for something like $5 billion so far, and I think that's just for the campfire fire up there, up north. But anyway, what they have decided to do, now you have to follow the logic of PG&E here, is when the Santa Ana winds whip up in Southern California, they decide that that's fire time. That's when the fires start hitting. So both up in Northern California and Southern California, they have determined when these winds whip up, they're going to cut power to certain areas where they believe fires are going to start because of the fire season and the winds. There is a problem with this. They don't do this until after a fire has started. So you have to ask yourself, why are they cutting the power after the fire has started? Makes one wonder what's going on. And they'll cut this power anywhere from 24 hours to 3 days, which brings us to another problem. The people that stay home and want to fight the fire with their hoses that they have to their house attached to their well can't do it, because when PG&E cuts the power to the well, of course, is shut off, and they are sitting there with no water at all as they watch their house burn.
Wow, golly, these people are PhD idiots.
Oh, they are Class A number one.
Insanity.
It is. It's crazy. It's beyond crazy. I can't figure out PG&E, $5 billion, why they haven't been going in these areas and spending that $5 billion before all these wildfires started. Why they didn't bury their wires underground like most everybody in the world does nowadays.
Wow. So are a lot of Shaun, I've got this very interesting question. It seems like to me that there might be arson in the background on some of this stuff. Is that a possibility?
Well, actually, no. That is very much a possibility. In fact, I believe it was 4 or 5 years ago they found an arsonist running around setting a lot of these wildfires, and it's been shown in the past too that's equally true. That there are arsonists that run around and start these fires. There is no two ways about that. That is absolutely true.
Incredible. It seems like to me, that here we go over to Iran and Iraq and bomb the hell out of other countries. It just seems like to me that some of these people that we're letting cross the border from Mexico might be coming here with the intention of doing the same thing for our country, which would include, setting torches in populated areas of water-starved California.
Yeah, I think that's called terrorism, and I think that's, I wouldn't doubt that is happening. And talking about water, I'm just learning now that at a record rate, because California has got so much water, as everybody all over the nation knows, they're pumping it into the Pacific Ocean at record rates.
Wow. And they're pumping into the Pacific Ocean all of the disease that exists on the streets of Los Angeles, the needles and the human excrement. That's going into the ocean also, isn't it?
Well, certainly Los Angeles, San Francisco, the Bay Area, you bet. And that's been a concern too. I've seen a lot of professors and doctors report on this and say, you guys, you don't understand the effect this is going to have on the rest of the world doing what you're doing, because these diseases, they're going to survive and they're going to go where the natural elements take them.
Wow. Well, hey, Shaun, I appreciate the update you've given us about the state of affairs out in California. But I think we got the purpose of this program is to discuss the state of affairs of America, and primarily, quite often, here on this program, we're talking about income taxes. Now, you and I have agreed before the program that we would have a topic of conversation this afternoon, and it's going to be related to the Foundation for the Federal Income Tax. And the Foundation for the Federal Income Tax will be found in the taxing provisions of the United States Constitution. But I'm surprised. There's a lot of people, just like when we're going through right now, this circus in Washington, D.C., people don't know much about impeachments. They got to have somebody tell them a little bit about the process of impeachment, which is a process covered by the United States Constitution. In reference to taxation, there's also a need to educate the American people about such foundational issues as, what are the taxing powers of the United States Constitution, which is one of the purposes of today's show. So can we get around to talking about... Well, first, let me ask this question. Do you see that there is a real need for the American people to be taught constitutional principles?
No question about it. The Constitution is the basis for all federal law and a tremendous amount of state law, too. And if you don't understand the basis of the laws that we live in under the states that the legislatures sit up in their state capitals and enact to control the people or for whatever purpose they enact it for, if you don't understand the basic elements, the basic document that allows them to do this, you really can't understand what's happening when these legislatures go out and create these laws. So it's fundamentally important that people have an understanding and grasp of the United States Constitution and their state constitution.
And in reference to taxation, do you find that there's a real important need for the American people to know something about what the Constitution provides for in reference to taxes? Is that something that, is real important?
That's more important than probably anything else, because as one justice of the Supreme Court said, and I don't recall his name right offhand, he said that the power to tax is the power to destroy. The United States government, through the power of taxation, has the capability of destroying anything it doesn't like as long as they act within the constraints of the Constitution, which explains their powers of taxation. And if the people don't understand that the United States government has been limited in their power of taxation, then they're ready to accept anything that the United States government offers up by way of a tax, and the government will then go ahead and tax any way they want, anybody they want, anything they want, in any manner they want, which is, I mean, that's despotism, and that's why we have laws and rules governing taxation.
Well, how about educating our listeners now? We've got maybe 3 or 4 more minutes before our first break, but that ought to give you enough time to get rolling.
It will. And before I start off this, what we're going to talk about...
But let's get off into this. You know, you're a scholar on the constitutional taxing provisions, and you just admitted that the American people need to know something about this matter. So take off.
Okay. We're going to start off with a quick clip from the Anti-Federalist Papers. Under the writer was Brutus. That's the name he wrote under. It was Essay 6, on December 27, 1787. Power of taxation was discussed by the Founding Fathers. And this is what Brutus, in his letters or his essay, wrote about the power of taxation, one of many things. He wrote the following, and then we'll get into the meat of the powers of taxation. He said, "This power, exercised without limitation, will introduce itself into every corner of the city and country. It will wait upon the ladies at their toilet and will not leave them in any of their domestic concerns. It will accompany them to the ball, the play, and the assembly. It will go with them when they visit and will, on all occasions, sit beside them in their carriages, nor will it desert them." Let's see. Nor will it desert them even at church. It will enter the house of every gentleman, watch over his cellar, wait upon his cook in the kitchen, follow the servants into the parlor, preside over the table, and note down all he eats and drinks. It will attend him to his bedchamber and watch him while he sleeps. It will take cognizance of the professional man in his office or his study. It will watch the merchant in the counting house or in his store. It will follow the mechanic to his shop and in his work, and will haunt him in his family and in his bed. It will be a constant companion of the industrious farmer in all his labor. It will be with him in the house and in the field, observe the toil of his hands and the sweat of his brow. It will penetrate into the most obscure cottage, and finally, it will light upon the head of every person in the United States. To all these different classes of people, in all these circumstances, in which it will attend them, the language in which it will address them will be give. Now, that's what these conversations the Founding Fathers had regarding the power of taxation. And with this quip in mind that was written by Brutus back in 1787, the Founding Fathers said, you know, he might have a point. This federal government needs a power of taxation, but it has to have limitations on it. So they sat down and started to write this into the Constitution. Basically, the Founding Fathers wrote into the Constitution 2 types of taxes: indirect taxes and direct taxes. Direct taxes are taxes that are placed upon you, upon a person or an entity that you cannot escape. You cannot pass this tax on to anyone else. When the government wants this money, they come looking to you, and you better have your wallet open. Indirect taxes, on the other hand, are taxes on products of consumption. You can escape the tax simply by not buying the product. The direct tax clause of the United States Constitution is found under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and it says, representatives in direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. Now, the direct taxes were so important to take note of by the Founding Fathers that they wrote about it again in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, in which they said again, they reiterated it to make sure nobody could escape this. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless proportioned to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. The idea was simply this. The government, if they were going to levy a direct tax, had to do it. They had to levy it among the several states, and it had to be levied in according to the population. In other words, if the federal government, after they collected all their excise taxes and so on and so forth, that indirect taxes that they used to run the normal and legitimate functions of the United States government.
Stop right there. Hey, the music's coming on, letting us know we got a first break. Hey, folks, after a few minutes, we'll be back with the second segment. We're trying to educate Americans about the Constitution Foundation for Federal Taxes. Stay tuned. Next week is Thanksgiving. This is the Friday before next Thursday's Thanksgiving. We're almost to the end of fall and the beginning of winter. And right after the start of winter, about a week later, the end of the year comes. And then starting in January of 2020, that's going to be the start of a new year. And boy, the media is going to be talking about, we're talking about it in a month and a half. The media is going to be talking about, these federal taxes. It's going to be everywhere. Well, we can also expect, we're probably going to be confronting in the new year stories about, the impeachment proceedings against President Trump. But be that as it may, taxes are real important. Now, right before the break, Shaun was getting into, I think he read something from the Federalist Papers talking about how taxation is really pervasive. And he's getting ready to pick up where we were right before the break in his presentation of, how we ended up with the particular taxing powers that are set forth in the United States Constitution. Can you pick up where we left off, Shaun?
You bet. I was explaining how the United States government goes about collecting direct taxes. However, I want to back up just a minute and cover Jefferson. When Jefferson, who was part of writing the Constitution, though he wasn't there, he did have much to say about it. He said that the idea of the United States government collecting direct taxes would be very rare because the excise taxes and the impost and import taxes would take care of the legitimate functions of the government. Jefferson reasoned that, first off, an indirect or a direct tax would be very difficult to collect, and that they are needed rarely, only in the time of war and emergency. So Jefferson never envisioned that direct taxes would become a sustaining element for the government to be able to operate under. Anyway, the way the federal government goes about collecting direct taxes subject to the rule of apportionment works like this. The House of Representatives sits down and determines the amount of revenue it needs. After it decides the amount of revenue it's going to collect from its excise taxes and indirect taxes, imports and imposts, they may have money that they need in addition to pay for the legitimate functions of the government, though Jefferson doubted that. Anyway, the way they go about doing it is the House of Representatives then says, okay, we've collected all our indirect taxes, and guess what? We have $1 million shortfall. Now, this is just an example because that's far and away not what the case is today. Nevertheless, they say we have $1 million shortfall. How are we going to collect that? Well, we're going to impose a direct tax. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, here's what the rule is. You see, there's a rule for the government to be able to collect direct taxes. Say, we have to decide how much money we must collect from each state. Well, how do we determine that? Well, we count the number of people and or representatives in the state, and we apportion the money to the states, among the states, according to their population and representation. For example, if California has 10% of the population, they get 10% of this tax bill. If South Dakota has 1% of the population, they get 1% of it. If Florida has 5% of the population, they get 5% of this tax bill, and so on until the entire $1 million is meted out among the several states. Then the federal government sends a bill to the state, to the governor, to the legislature, and say, we need X amount of money. You have to collect it from your citizens. You collect it from your citizens. You see, the Founding Fathers never envisioned that we, the citizens of the United States, would ever see a federal tax collector. They never saw this even possibly beginning to happen. So the state governments would go out and they would raise the money that the federal government decided it needed from that state to continue operating from their citizens. They would collect, or the state would collect the money from their citizens, and the state would send it to the federal government. You know, there was a hitch here, too. Back in those days, prior to the 17th Amendment, the senators were elected, or appointed, rather, by the governor and legislatures of each state. The senators representing the states, not the people. That's how it was in the original Constitution. So when the governor and the legislature would receive a bill from the federal government, if they thought the bill was excessive, if they didn't like it, if they didn't like what was happening, they could recall their senator and bring him back and put him before the state government and say, Senator, you better start explaining to us what's going on in Washington, and you better make it really good when we have to lay out this kind of money. In other words, there was accountability for the senators to the states. And then the 17th Amendment came along, which is another discussion for another day. Moving on to indirect taxes. Indirect taxes, as I said, was the main source of revenue that Jefferson envisioned the United States government running its legitimate functions under. This power of taxation can be found under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and it reads, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. You see, just like direct taxes has the rule of apportionment, in other words, they have to apportion that tax among the states, as I explained, the indirect taxes also have a rule. In other words, they have to be uniform throughout the United States. There were a few reasons for this. Jealousy among the states were one of them. In other words, if the federal government sat back and decided that it favored Georgia over New York, Georgia might not be taxed as much as New York, and New York may be taxed more when the federal government levied an excise tax on a commodity. And they thought, no, we can't have that. That wouldn't be good. We had to impose differing rates on differing states, so that we'd create a civil war. Well, that happened anyway, but not for this reason, at least so they say. So what they decided was that, listen, anytime we impose a direct tax, it has to be uniform, and basically it works like this. If the government's going to impose a nickel on a tax on every tire they sell, people sell throughout the United States, or businesses sell throughout the United States, that tax has to be imposed at 5 cents per tire in every state. There is no deviation in the amount among the states. Each state has to charge a nickel for every tire. The federal government has to charge a nickel for every tire in every state. There are no exceptions to that. That is the rule of uniformity. Jefferson, again, he opined that, this indirect taxation, this is a good power of taxation. It provide for all the normal government functions. And he reasoned that the tax would remain moderate, because if it didn't, the government would be in trouble. He reasoned that if it remained moderate, the people would gladly pay the tax and fill the government coffers. But if it was not moderate, if it was excessive and abusive, he reasoned that the people would avoid it and evade it, and the government coffers would shrink. And it was pretty good reasoning. I mean, it sounded like a good plan. So, an indirect tax, subject to the rule of uniformity, is the rule, and direct taxes are subject to the rule of apportionment. Now, let me give you some examples of indirect taxes. We have the alcohol tax under Title 26, which is the Internal Revenue Code, Section 5001. 5001 imposes the tax on a gallon of alcohol. It tells you how much the federal government is going to tax a gallon of alcohol. Section 5005 creates liability on the distiller or the importer of that alcohol. In other words, the gallon of alcohol can't pay the tax. A human being has to be liable to pay the tax that the federal government wants collected. Therefore, after they impose the tax, the federal government imposes the tax, the federal government has to make someone liable for it. Tobacco tax is another example. Under the Internal Revenue Code, under Section 5701, you'll find that there is a tobacco tax imposed. They call it on tubes of tobacco and various tobacco products. The amount of tax is imposed under 5701 on tobacco products. The next section, 5703, which follows, creates liability. In other words, it makes a human being liable for collecting that tax and paying it over to the federal government. This is the normal way the powers of taxation work. Here's the problem we have with the income tax when we look at these two powers. Which power of taxation does it fall under? direct or indirect? Well, if it's a direct tax, it has to be apportioned among the several states. Now, the government, as Larry will explain later on, the government no longer, or doesn't except for maybe one outlier, one case that I read a long time ago, that said that the income tax was some kind of a special tax not subject to the rule of apportionment, but that's not the truth. As Larry will tell you, there are federal cases federal Supreme Court cases that deal with that. Anyway, the government has finally decided that, gee, you know what, it isn't a direct tax. It isn't subject to apportionment because it's not a direct tax, and the 16th Amendment bears that out. So they'll explain to you, well, it's an indirect tax. And I'm sitting there thinking, an indirect tax. The government says the federal income tax is an indirect tax. How can this be? How is it uniform when I sit here, pay so much, my neighbor pays a different amount, somebody in a different state pays a different amount, somebody in Florida pays a different amount in California? Now, how can this be uniform, monetarily speaking? So I called the IRSF. I said, you guys, if I understand this right, you say this is an indirect tax, the income tax, and it's uniform throughout the United States, right? This is your position? And the agent said, let me get somebody. And so he did, and he came back and he said, yes, that's our position, that it is an indirect tax that everybody's required to pay. I said, great, so tell me something. How is it uniform, given the fact that even my neighbor doesn't pay the same amount I do, and other people in other states don't? Tell me, how is it uniform? And he says, well, you know all these forms you can go to the post office and get? We got a lot of them, hundreds of them. You can go to the post office in every state of the union and get these same forms. They're uniform, so we've met the rule of uniformity. Think about that. Yeah, Larry, think about that. There's one, I read a Lincoln University Law Review here years and years and years ago, which professors sat down and wrote this, and they spent something like 30 or 40 pages trying to explain the federal income tax. And reading this was really a chore back in those days for me, and when they got done, it must have been a chore for them, because when they were finished, what they said is, well, here's what we conclude after we have studied the income tax. We have decided one thing for sure, and that is that an income tax is indeed an income tax. So, that's
incredible. It's an income tax, but they couldn't put it into a constitutional classification, either direct or indirect?
They couldn't, because there were so many different ways they thought that it could or should or maybe could be applied, or how it could be applied, but nobody could come down decisively and say this was it.
Wow, unbelievable! But that's to be expected from here in America. Hey, folks, I'm going to pick up and give you my little treatment of direct and indirect taxes. But before I do, I want to tell you, over on my website, I've got a discussion of this very same point. Now, if you want to get to my website, I've got two websites. One is for my law office. Don't go there. That's LarryBecraft.org. Go to, the only way this is posted on my internet service provider, which is highway.net. And the way you will find this website where I have legal materials posted is, the best way to get there is type in Dixieland Law Journal into an internet search engine. Now, when you get over the Dixieland Law Journal, after you found it using some search engine other than Google, you'll find that on the front page there's not but about 7 or 8 or 9 links to other pages. Other pages linked off the front page, there's one called Taxation. Now, when you get to the taxation page from the front page of the Dixieland Law Journal, you can go over to and you'll find a page that's got a bunch of other links to various detailed topics related to income taxation. And what I would like to direct our listeners to, for what I'm getting ready to get into and talk about, there's a file on this page called Uncertainty of the Law. Now, the reason I'm got this point that I'm talking about that deals with the constitutional foundation for the federal income tax, the reason I am directing you to a file called Uncertainty of the Law over on my taxation page is because that's exactly what it is. Today's courts cannot tell you. They've spoken out of both sides of the mouth. Some courts say, the federal income tax is an excise tax, and others say it's a direct. So even after, here, how many, golly, 1791 is when the federal government was created. In 1991, that was 200 years it had been in operation. And we are almost 3 decades after the federal government had been operating for 200 years. Now, folks, in the background, the music's coming on. We got a break coming up. And welcome back to the final segment of this afternoon's edition of the Truth Attack Hour. A minute ago, I got onto an internet search engine to try to find a website that would tell you about the budgets of the federal government. And I found www.usgovernmentspending.com. Now, at that website, you can pull up, if you want to know the spending of the federal government in 1792, you can see it. If you want to find the federal government's budget in 1800, 1850, 1900, 1950, 2000, it's on this page. Now, let me tell our listeners what the budget of the federal government was. What was the total expenditures in 1792? Now, remember, we had about 3 million people in this country back in 1792, and the total federal government spending in 1792 was $5.1 million. $5.1 million. Now, we didn't have an income tax back in those days. And, the revenue of the federal government, as Shaun was telling you, is derived primarily from these external indirect taxes, primarily the duties and imposts imposed upon the goods brought into this country. But, the per capita amount of money spent per capita back in 1792 for the population of the United States was less than $2 per person. Isn't that amazing?
Say, Larry, I'm back.
Good. Okay, we're just rolling along, Shaun. Now, I want to give a little bit different presentation of the reasons why we have these taxing powers in the United States Constitution. The first federal government we had in this country was the federal government created by the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, Congress didn't have a power of taxation. Now, to remedy this problem, the Philadelphia Convention was called. There was a purpose in 1787. The states wanted, we're finding out the government under the Articles of Confederation needs to be, improved somewhat. So they said we're going to have a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1782. Now, when the delegates got there, they found out that, making amendments to the Articles of Confederation simply wasn't going to be enough. What they needed to do was to draft a new constitution. And since the federal government under the Articles of Confederation had no powers of taxation, the Constitutional Convention was going to give Uncle Sam a power of taxation. But back in those days, as today, most of the revenue of the state governments was derived from what was commonly called back in those days direct taxes. And the framers at the convention said, well, we can't invade the same revenue sources as the states. So they envisioned that the primary source of revenue for the federal government would be indirect taxes. And those are excises, duties, and imposts. And so, the scheme that was set up by the Constitutional Convention was the state's going to have as primary revenue sources direct taxes, which are taxes imposed upon things and people. And the federal government would have, a corresponding power taxation that didn't involve the same subjects, and that was the indirect taxes, primarily as, until the Civil War, was primarily the duties and imposts imposed upon goods imported into this country. And so, the scheme that was envisioned by the means of the Constitutional Convention was to have this grand, structure across America in reference to taxation. States had direct taxes. Federal government had indirect taxes, primarily customs and duties on imported goods. And the federal government derived in 1792, as I said a minute ago, $5.1 million. That was the expenditures of the federal government. Now, I want to tell our listeners something about what Shaun covered it real well, what a direct tax is like. I thought it would be important for our listeners in today's program to have access to and look at a direct tax, because we've only had about 4 direct taxes in the history of the federal government. The purpose of giving the federal government a power of direct taxation is that, as Shaun mentioned, there may be an emergency that arises in which the federal government will need to invade the revenue sources of the states, and they would need to impose direct taxes. But direct taxes had to be apportioned. Now, as Shaun said, what is a direct apportioned tax? Well, it's dependent upon the state's representation in Congress, the percentage. Now, hey, all of the entire Congress of the United States, the House of Representatives, there's 100%. We got the entire House of Representatives constitutes 100%. However, California's representation in the House of Representatives might be, as Shaun mentioned, 10%. It might have 10% of the representatives in Congress, and as a consequence, it will pay 10% of a direct tax. Now, if you really want to see what a direct tax look like, over on my website, you can have access to. Look around. I've got links to, years ago, I completely strung together the entire United States statutes at large, every volume, and made them word searchable. If you want to find out what, a direct tax looks like, get your hands on Volume 3 of the United States Statutes at Large, a link to which you will find over on my website. And when you pull up Volume 3 of the Statutes at Large, turn to page 53. Now, what is happening, what legislation do we find at 3 Statutes at Large, page 53? Well, this happens to be in 1813, which is when the War of 1812 was being raged. Well, this happens to be one of the direct taxes Congress passed back during the War of 1812, and taking a look at this particular act will show you what a direct tax is like. When you see, how Congress drafted it, how it was enacted into law, you'll get a real good idea about what a direct tax is. Now, let me just read you the act itself. Starts about middle of page 53, and I'm going to read to you portions of this act. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that a direct tax of $3 million shall be and is hereby laid upon the United States, and apportioned to the states respectively in the manner following. The first state, to the state of New Hampshire, $96,793.37. To the state of Massachusetts, $316,270.98. To the state of Rhode Island, $34,702.18. And you can go through all the states that were then admitted into the Union. There was a certain amount that each state had to pay, and the total of the money that was to be raised was, for this act, $3 million. However, if you go through it, you'll find that, the taxes were not only laid on the states, but it went down into, the Act of Congress went a step further. Not only did they say the amount that each state would provide, but then they specified how much was to come from each county. And on page 54 of this particular act, I'm going to read to you one section for the tax imposed regarding the state of New Hampshire. On the County of Rockingham, $25,298.89. On the County of Stratford, $17,698.66. And you can go through this act and you can see how Congress imposed on each specific, you can read in the acts, each county, each state. Of course, they apportioned how much each county in the state was required to pay. But each state had a specific amount it had to pay. And, of course, as Shaun mentioned a minute ago, that the states were going to be getting these bills, and it would be left up to the states to determine how it was raised. And if a state came forward, like in this particular act, and I can't tell you, and, I have to go do some digging around in history, but we do know that there was a tax imposed on Massachusetts of $316,200, $270. I'm presuming that the state of Massachusetts paid that tax. And in that event, then Uncle Sam, the federal government, wouldn't try to go to the people who lived in that state to collect that tax. Now, that's exactly what a direct tax is. And as we have covered during the course of this program, there's a real reason why the taxing powers in this country are set up the way that they're set up. The states are going to be relying on primarily upon direct taxes as a source of revenue, and Uncle Sam is to be relying upon primarily the indirect taxes as a source of revenue, and that's the way it's been for a long time. Now, we're almost to the end of the program because I've got 5:52, and we're probably going to be covering this again and the picking up where we are right now in the next few weeks. But I want to tell our listeners that, now that you have a good foundation as to direct taxes and indirect taxes, where does the federal income tax fall into? Typically when new taxes were offered by the federal government, when Congress would come out with something new, like an estate and gift tax, or tax on a different kind of booze, or tax on carriages or whatever. There would be often when a new tax was imposed by Congress, there would be a challenge made. Typically, those acts would be drafted like an indirect tax. And the parties that would oppose the tax would come along and try to say, this is a direct tax, and therefore it's unconstitutional. Now, that's exactly what they did. One time during the Civil War, Congress comes along and passed it to drive out of circulation state banknotes. A tax was imposed upon state banknotes. I think it was 10%. And the purpose of that tax on state banknotes was to drive banknotes out of circulation so that the only currency in circulation was greenbacks issued by Uncle Sam. And Bank of the United States, the national bank notes that had been authorized, created by Congress in 1863. So in 1894, when Congress comes along and passes a federal income tax, just like has been typical in the past, when a new tax comes along, there's going to be a challenge to it, and there was a challenge to the constitutionality of the 1894 Act, and the argument was, this is a direct property tax, and the Supreme Court found the 1894 income tax to be unconstitutional because it was a direct tax. Now, Shaun, the music's coming on, letting us know the end of the show has arrived. I want to thank you for being my co-host this week, and be sure to come back next week, folks.